Yo, what's going on, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka I've got the top 15 cards from the newest Pokemon Pocket Set Triumphant Light ready to go in this list. But I wanted to tell you that I do think there's an interesting takeaway from this mini set. I think this is potentially the weakest set that we have seen so far in the entire game's history. And I'm going to go ahead and kind of show you some side-by-side comparisons, but that was something that kind of stood out to me as I was going through this list, and I'll talk a little bit more about it as we recap the top 15. And again, thank you guys for supporting the channel, for clicking on the videos, for leaving those likes and those comments. I got to go back through the comments from the past few days and go ahead and respond to you guys. I like to keep that going and, interact with you guys because you guys are what makes this work. But let's get to the top 15. I'm going to start off with a notable mention. This Magnezone is pretty interesting, but it's just not necessarily too playable right now, especially being a stage 2. It does have an interesting ability, but again, it's just something that probably is not ever really going to see play. And honestly, it's just got an interesting effect, but that's about it. But I would say this is a notable mention, if that. And definitely there are better cards to play, in my opinion, over Magnezone. Even though there is a little bit of synergy with, Magneton from Genetic Apex ramping itself, and then, being able to maybe pivot into a Magnezone. But the thing is, with two metal energies needed, right, it's kind of one of those things where you can't really depend on it. So I just don't think that this card is going to really see a lot of play at all. But I just wanted to mention it because, again, this set just doesn't have a lot of cards for me to pick from. Starting at number 15, this is the Rotom Psychic type, the one that has the sniping ability, and the sniping ability is decent, but again, I just don't think that it necessarily has a place in the meta as of right now. And maybe as time goes on, somebody finds a spot for it, and it's kind of like a universal card that can be played in every deck that has energies, right? Because it's a colorless energy, to be able to get that sniping technology. So that's the one thing that it has going for it. But outside of that, it does have that ability where it's linked with Arceus. But I just don't think that it's necessarily good enough to see play necessarily right now. But maybe in some restricted formats, maybe in no EX. But yeah, right now this card just feels very underwhelming. Number 14 is Toxicroak. I know Raven recently played this in a Ursi Day tournament, and honestly, it wasn't terrible. But again, I could see this card getting more support down the line, maybe later on as more cards coming out. Because again, doing 20 damage with poison is pretty good, and even in the paper trading card game, 20 damage on poison is usually pretty decent. And there's definitely some things that are working against this card, like not actually having an attack after you poison them. It kind of leaves you in a weird spot, like you have to pivot out of it sometimes. But again, it is a pretty interesting card. I think it's probably decent. I just don't necessarily think that it has a solidified home in a deck of 20 cards right now in terms of the open format. Maybe for non-EX there's definitely some cookage that you could do, but again, I just look at this card and it's just a little bit underpowered. Number 13 would be Houndoom. This is a card that I think people probably need to cook a little bit more with, especially as the meta develops. The idea of potentially trapping EXs and then being able to outpace them for a 1 prize versus 2 prize kind of trade seems enticing. The question is, like, where do you put this card, right? Like, what deck does this card find a home? Because we saw with Galvantula and Pikachu that there was a little bit of an argument that could be made for playing, the spider with Galvantula and I believe the basic of it that does, like 30 damage for 1 energy. And like it could put a lot of pressure on legendary birds. I think it's called Joltik. But with this card in particular, I don't necessarily know that you can get a lot of value out of this outside of like kind of really building your deck around it. And we just haven't seen that deck come to fruition yet. But I do think that the upside of this card is potentially enticing, especially, like I said, if you can trap a 2-pointer or a 2-prize Pokemon and be able to outrace it, and now you just need to knock out one more Pokemon. So, again, people will say things like Infernape potentially. I don't know. People might say things like Heatran, Arceus, and again, like, maybe there's an argument there. Maybe it would be a good idea in the mirror match, like Arceus Dialga versus Arceus Heatran Houndoom. Maybe that's a thing. But again, I just don't think that this deck necessarily has a home yet. But there's definitely some interesting potential. I mean, there's always been those anti-meta decks that played Arbok and Galvantula. So I just wonder where the cookage will be with this card. Getting to number 12, Glaceon EX is a card that I've tried to make work in a bunch of different decks, and it just continues to fall short. There's some interesting interactions, like if you play Druddigon and Glaceon, and then there's obviously the Greninja Glaceon kind of combo. But again, like, you're just relying on multiple evolutions. You're relying on pretty low HP as well, all things considered. Like 140 is kind of low. When you kind of take a look around the meta, and then obviously 120 from Greninja can be very fragile as you're trying to evolve it. So I think that, this card is something that's like really unique in what it does, and some people have a hard time keeping track of the damage that Glaceon can do because they don't realize that once it switches in, it's going to ping. So like, there's some weird interactions, but like, just right now, I don't necessarily think that it's very playable. But again, like, let's just say that we eventually get cards that can, pull EV evolutions out of your deck. Well, hey, maybe this card could see some play after that. But again, like, wouldn't you just play Leafeon? So again, like, I just don't think that this card is like very good, but it's definitely interesting, and who knows, maybe some people can cook with it. But for the time being, I've got it at number 12, and we'll move on from there. Number 11 is Probopass EX, and I have it above Glaceon EX just because, in my opinion, the higher HP it matters. It's the same attack cost, right? And it's got a bigger upside with the attack. It's got good synergy with Dialga, with Adaman. And, when you look at cards like Glaceon, you're kind of like, well, what is its best partner? Is its best partner Manaphy? Is its best partner Palkia, Vaporeon? Like, what's the best partner there? But I think with Probopass, it's pretty like set in stone. Like, you just play this with Dialga, and you got a decent metal deck. Now, is it better than some of the other steel type / metal decks? I mean, probably not, but again, I do think that it's probably better than Glaceon in comparison. The attack, like I said, it's kind of interesting when you look at this card, because with Adaman, you're potentially taking a significant less amount of damage, right? And even if you compare this card to Magnezone takes 30 less damage if Arceus is in play. But it is a stage 2 versus Probopass being a stage 1. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there. I wouldn't be surprised to see this card like continue to see like some play, but it's just like not very good though. Like nobody is probably playing this card thinking, you know what, I'm going to win this Ursa Day or Pocket Legends League or, Dark League or whatever that's called tournament. I don't think anybody's really doing that. I think it's more of a meme than anything, right? The 10th best card that I've got in the set is Garchomp EX. The sniping ability is very cool and unique. The 3 energy attack is a little bit pricey and can be a little bit of a detriment to the card. I think, all things considered, I would probably rather play Gallade than I would Garchomp. But for the people that love dragons, right, and love Garchomp, you definitely have some options, especially with the fighting Pokemon that are in the game right now, that you can pair with Garchomp. The other upside of Garchomp is that it does have a decent amount of bulk, so like it's pretty decent, but again, that grass weakness can be a detriment. You have to probably play the dragon type Gible. Gabite, a little bit more debatable, but you probably do have to play like, cards that don't necessarily always get the benefit of like cards like Lucario. So like, if you're playing Gible, Lucario might have a little bit of a clash there because your Gibble might be Dragon. And then if you play Gabite, then the Lucario and the Gabite obviously don't mix as well if it's the Dragon type. So there's some weird interactions there. But again, overall, I would just probably lean more into Gallade than I would Garchomp EX. Number 9 is Adamant. Adamant is fascinating because if Steel ever really like takes off, if we ever get a Steel type basic, it's interesting to think about what an 18 trainer Steel deck would look like. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of interesting. The other way that I look at this card is it's basically a giant cape for one turn, right? You're basically hoping that the turn that you play Adamant, your Pokemon survives an extra turn and your opponent can't really play around it, and then you're able to punish them. That's kind of the way that I see Adamant, right? You're able to extend the life of your Pokemon just enough to hopefully swing the game. And like when you say stuff like that, it kind of makes sense when you compare it to cards like Giant Cape and even cards like Blue in terms of how they were supposed to be used. But for this case, it's very narrow, being only Steel types, and there's just not a lot to work with there. Now, could you make a one prize Steel deck? Sure, but again, like Skarmory and Adamant, it's just a weird combination to me. Like I could see Adamant, Skarmory, and Rocky Helmet being sort of decent if you're able to get an extra turn, right? Because they hit your Skarmory, you know, it survives an extra turn because you played Adamant, and hopefully your Rocky Helmet pings them, right, for 20, and then you're able to hit them for 50 more damage. I think that could potentially have a little bit of promise, but again, like typically when you're playing aggressive cards and aggressive decks like that, you typically want more damage instead of damage reduction. But again, that's some interesting, you know, technology there. If somebody plays Skarmory Rocky Helmet, it's a little unnerving, and then like, you know, if you have a clock ready to knock out this Skarmory and they play Adamant, you're just kind of like, oh wow, that's like potentially 70 extra damage that my Pokemon is about to take. And if it's an EX, well, hey, you know, that's a little bit of a problem. So again, I could see this card, you know, hanging around and making a bigger appearance, you know, later on in the game or later on in the meta. And heck, I might have to go cook with it now that, you know, I've talked about this Skarmory Rocky Helmet technology. Carnivine, number 8. It's very interesting to look at this card, and I have it lower than the other partners, the other links with Arceus. Outside of like Rotom, right? I have it in Magnezone. I have it lower than, you know, stuff like Crobat, stuff like Heatran, stuff like, you know, I think those are the other two, right? But I have it lower just because like alone, this card is so bad, right? Like if you play Carnivine and for whatever reason you don't have Arceus, like you just feel lost. You know what I mean? Like that's a horrible situation to be in. And so because of that, I have it lower on my ratings than some of the other Link Pokemon with Arceus. But, you know, again, the upside of this card is it's doing 50 damage with Arceus on the board, which can put a lot of pressure on those fighting decks that have grass weaknesses. But again, you know, I just look at this card and I'm like, man, it feels kind of weird to play a card that is so drastically worse whenever you don't have Arceus out there, right? Like that's kind of a problem. You know what I mean? Like Heatran, it can be fine on its own, right? Crobat, if you're able to find it and evolve it, like, you know, hey, at least it's got free retreat. But this card, it's just like, oh man, I can't do the extra damage, and I kind of needed it. So that's why I have it a little bit lower than the other Link Pokemon on the list that you'll see later on down. But for right now, I would say Carnivine is decent at number 8. For number 7, I've got Crobat. Crobat is a card that a lot of people will compare with Greninja. And the one thing that I would say is this: if you're staring down a Greninja, you feel threatened. If you're staring down a Crobat, I feel like that height of being threatened is higher. Okay, I think that Crobat across from you at the table, or, you know, however you want to phrase that, right? If you're looking on your phone and you see, oh my gosh, my opponent's got a Crobat, it's a little unnerving. And I think that 30 damage, even though it's limited to just the active, is so crucial for fixing one-hit KOs and for obviously fixing two-hit KOs. Yeah, obviously you would love to be able to hit things on the bench for 30, but also with cards like Cyrus, you kind of think, hey, I mean, there's always those turns where you can Cyrus something out, ping it for 30, it's knocked out, now they have to bring in something else. So there's always ways that you can kind of manipulate it, but I do think that Crobat is worth trying out if you haven't played it yet and you're just kind of wanting to cook with something new. The Crobat Heatran Arceus deck was very cool, very innovative, and I think that that's just kind of touching the iceberg, right? Like, hey, I could definitely see Arceus Darkrai Crobat being a thing. I could see Arceus Crobat Magnezo being a thing. Like, even though obviously that's a lot of stage 2, so you probably would want to stay away from that and kind of lean more into the basic pressure Pokemon. But it's very cool to, cook with this card, and if you can find the pieces to Crobat line, it's very good. And so I think a lot of the decks that are playing Crobat should probably be on at least one Pokemon Communications, so that way they can hopefully increase their percentage odds of finding the Crobat line, especially if you can find it on Curve with Arceus out there. Shaman at number 6 is a card that was a pleasant surprise because I think that this opens up the door to aggro one prize decks, right? I think that if you have aggro one prizers that can eventually like go toe to toe with EX Pokemon, something like a Sudowoodo, I think that it makes this card a lot better. And if we get basic EX Pokemon as good as Arceus, as good as Dialga, Shaman is definitely worth looking at. Just to kind of think about this card. If we ever got, big, bulky fighting Pokemon that could get free retreat with Shaman, I mean, that's a big deal. So there's a lot of different ways that this card can continue to get better as the game is out longer and more cards come out. And then right now, I think that I would probably lean more towards the healing Shaman than I would the retreat Shaman and some of these Arceus Dialga decks. But I definitely think that there's an argument that could be made that Shaman has a home and maybe some of the other decks that we've seen in the meta that are, dependent on basic Pokemon. And obviously, like, the thing is too, if you're playing, 6 basic Pokemon in one stage 1 line, I think you can still probably get away with playing Shaman. But it is worth noting that, again, this Pokemon does have to be on the bench for you to get its ability. Now, if you have 2, well, then, that kind of cancels that out. You can put one in the active, one on the bench. But again, I do think that Shaman is really interesting, and I think that it can get better over time. And that's something that made me rank it a little bit higher than some of the other cards on the list, even though, Crobat right now is pretty decent if you can get it out. Heatran at number 5 is a card that, last meta with all the Executors, I think this card would have been, really good even without the Link ability. Now, as we're kind of seeing, the meta take shape and, we see a lot of fighting decks, Heatran is one of those odd cards that can actually kind of go toe to toe with those fighting decks, especially if it can, absorb some damage before it, starts attacking for 100 for 80 damage. And like, that's a lot of damage, right? Like 80 damage takes care of a lot of fighting basic Pokemon. And then on the other side, when you talk about what Heatran does to cards like Executor EX, Serebii EX, Leafeon EX, like, it's very good. Then also you look at Dialga EX, you can start to see how this card is probably the best partner for Arceus, even though it's a little limited in terms of its bulk when you start thinking about, stuff like Magnezone, stuff like Darkrai that can potentially put it into range very easily. Obviously Crobat can put this into range of Darkrai. There's a lot of things that are working against this card, but I do think that when it's good, it's very good, a very explosive card that a lot of decks have to hit to knock it out, right? That's the big issue with this card, is that a lot of decks have to hit it once and then KO it the next turn, right? And so that's going to basically allow you to potentially get 2 attacks off with this Heatran. And if you can line it up into an EX and trade 1 for 2, like 1 prizer for a 2 prizer, that's really good. So again, I do think that Heatran is very deserved to be in the top 5, but let's get to number 4. For number 4, I got Sudowoodo, and Sudowoodo is a card that has really stormed onto the meta, and I do think that it's very solid. And I'll talk about, one of the big differences with this set is that a lot of these cards are meta dependent. They're not meta defining, right? Like Gyarados was meta defining. For a little bit, Mew EX and cards like Leaf and Druddigon were meta defining, right? with cards like Sudowoodo, they're more like tech cards that are meta dependent, and that's the same for like almost every card on this list that I've gone over so far. And like that's the issue, I think, if you're like comparing this set to some of the other sets, is like there's probably 2-3 cards that are legitimately meta defining from this set, but outside of those cards, there's a big drop off. Like if you look at the cards 4 through 15 in the notable mention, they're all, in my opinion, significantly weaker than the cards that I have in the top 3. And that's one of the big issues that I see with this set, is that the gap between the best cards in the set and the other cards is gigantic, right? Like that's the big thing that I noticed. But again, Sudowoodo is fantastic right now in the current state of the game when you talk about the number of basic EX Pokemons, the number of EX Pokemons in general, and then also the weakness that Arceus EX has. So again, I do think that this card is decent, but again, it's very meta dependent instead of meta defining. That's just my opinion though. Number 3, I think this is where the gap is. I think 3 and 4 is where the gap is. I think Arita and the other 2 cards that I have listed are very good and like borderline like meta defining in a lot of ways, because this allows you to play, you know, dual type energies in some decks. It allows you to get more healing cards, and then over the span of the game, right, every water deck that's playing 18 trainers is going to be playing Arita, right? So I think that this card has a bigger impact than every other card in terms of like being meta defining, right? And when I look at this card, it's a supporter. Obviously you can only play 1 per turn, but I do think that this card is rightfully justified at in the top 3. And when we come back to this rating and kind of compare, in 2 weeks or so, maybe 3 weeks, maybe I'll wait till the first week of ranked or whatever, but when we come back and revisit this list, it will not shock me to see Arita stay in the top 3, definitely in the top 5. I would be shocked if it doesn't, just because of the fact that there's so many 18 trainer decks that we're seeing now compared in the tournament scene compared to all the time before, right? And Arita is a big reason why that's possible. So again, meta defining versus a card that's like meta dependent, I think Arita is more meta defining. Number 2 should not surprise anybody. Leafeon EX has been a very fun card to play with, a very good card, and the fact that it can deal 70 damage as early as turn 3 of the entire game is insane, right? Actually, I guess I should say turn 4, right? Turn 4 technically, because you're going second, you attach an energy. Turn 3, your opponent. Turn 4, your turn, you evolve, attach with Leafeon. If you go first, obviously you can't put an energy down. So on turn 3 of the game, right? So you pass your opponent, that's turn 2. It's your turn, turn 3, you evolve, you attach an energy. You only have 2 energy. So that's worth talking about. But again, like as far as like early tempo and the synergy that this card has with Serebii, after you get that turn 4 where you put the energy on Leafeon EX in the active and you start swinging for 70, now if you have Serebii, you're just loading energies onto that Serebii, making it a gigantic nuke. And there's, a lot of, you got to deal a lot of damage to KO Leafeon, because a lot of the time there's going to be heal, there's going to be capes, there's going to be stuff that's going to go ahead and prolong the life of this Leafeon. So even though Arceus Dialga is fantastic and very good, without Arceus Dialga, Leafeon would just be extremely, I don't want to say oppressive, but dominant is probably the best word. And again, I look at a card like this, to me, this is more meta-defining than meta-dependent, because it's a card that on its own kind of like creates multiple decks, right? So again, number 2 on the list, probably one of my favorite cards to play with in the new set. Very fun card, but by now, you can probably guess what number 1 is. So let's talk about number 1. Number 1 is going to be Arceus EX, a card that initially, I think I put too much stock into the links, right? I think I put too much stock into the fact that the link Pokemon were kind of like mid to decent. And I really overlooked the synergy that this card had with something like Dialga that had been desperately in need of a partner that can start putting pressure on that third energy, right? Because Dialga is going to ramp you to 2. Now you just need, that third energy that you're going to put from your hand or from your energy zone on that next turn and then start being able to pressure. And like that was something that I probably didn't put enough value in, but this card is fantastic. It's very good, right? The only issues with this card are its lack of bulk and the fact that the fighting Pokemon in this game line up very well into it. And so like that's the biggest issue with Arceus, but outside of that, Arceus EX is very, very good. Again, meta defining. All right, right? Like that's what we're seeing right now. This card is clearly meta defining and not meta dependent. And it's obviously the 2 retreat can be a little bit of an issue, but again, a lot of those decks are playing Shaman or Leaf in some combination, and basically being able to mitigate that. So again, Arceus EX to me, the best card in the set, and Leafeon number 2, Arita number 3. I think those are pretty clear in the top 3 cards of the set. But now I want to show you the comparisons between the 3 new expansions. So let's talk about that for a second. So when I was looking at this set and ranking it, it was very difficult because like a lot of these cards are just like not very good. And so it made me wonder like just how big of a gap is it between the top cards in the set and like how does it compare to the other sets that we've seen. And I color coded the space-time category because blue is going to be the Palkia pack and then gray is going to be Dialga, green is both. But let's just kind of compare this really quickly. Like let's start towards the bottom, right? Like the bottom of Space-Time Smackdown is going to be like Bastiodon, Rampardos, Pachirisu. And arguably like Pachirisu should be higher on the list now that we kind of see the 18 trainer deck and it's getting more results and so on. But again, like you compare that to Houndoom, Toxicroak, Rodon. And then you look at Mythical Island. Okay, well, sure. Blue, Vaporeon, Budding. Okay, those are all pretty situational cards. Some of those are not even played anymore, really. Okay, maybe Vaporeon is a little bit higher now because, we started to see more water support in Space-Time Smackdown and so on. Hey, maybe you can make that argument. Then when you look at the top of the list, okay, now the top of the list is pretty, I would say, roughly pretty even across the board, right? Like, obviously, Darkrai, Magnezone, Cyrus, like meta-defining, right? Mythical Slab, Gyarados, and Mute EX at that time were meta-defining, right? Triumphant Light, Arceus, Leafeon, Arita, pretty close to being meta-defining, right? Then you get into like the 4, 5, 6 range, right? So you look at the 4, 5, 6 range for Triumphant Light, Sudowoodo, Shaman, and Heatran, right? Compare that to Giant Cape, Pokemon Communication, and Rocky Helmet, right? I mean, it's not even close. Okay, compare it to Serebii, Leaf, and Druddigon. Like literally not even close. Okay, keep going down the list. Okay, Superior, Weavile, Crobat. Okay, Weavile's probably the best card in that. Crobat's probably better than Superior, right? Okay, so there you go. Golem, Palkia, Carnivine. I mean, Carnivine, decent. But Golem, obviously in the no EX format, very good. And at that time, Golem had its time to shine in that Ursa Day tournament where it won. And then Palkia EX, pretty decent, right? There's an entire deck built around Palkia EX, right? So, hey, maybe it's a little bit more even there, but then you got cards like Marshadow, right? And could Marshadow be higher now, like knowing what we know now in terms of the state of the meta? Absolutely, like Marshadow could be higher. Marshadow's probably better than Adamant, right? Manaphy, pretty good. Then you start looking at Aerodactyl EX, Pidgeot EX, okay? Dawn, Dialga, Garchomp, Probopass. Like, obviously, Garchomp and Probopass are probably equal to or worse than Aerodactyl and Pidgeot. That's probably what I would say, right? And then, Dawn and Dialga. Dialga EX stocks went way up, so you'd probably move that card up on the list. But again, like, my whole point of talking about this is, at the time of these cards in Mythical Island and Space-Time Smackdown, I feel like those sets were way more impactful for what those cards did than the cards that we have for Triumphant Light outside of the top 3. Like, I feel like just the gap between 1, 2, 3 for Triumphant Light versus everything else is just like massive. Whereas, Space-Time Smackdown, dude, the top 6 cards are absolute bangers. Then when you talk about how Dialga has aged, how Pachirisu has aged, how Rampardos has aged, bangers. You take a look at Mythical Island. Mythical Slab at the time was very, very good, right? Ended up kind of falling off. Then you got Gyarados, Mew EX, Celebi EX, Leaf, Druddigon, Marshadow. I mean, all those cards are very, very good, even pretty decent now. So again, like, I just think that, yeah, let's just say that you wanted to compare only the mini sets, right? Only the mini sets. You know, take Space Time Smackdown out of it. Dude, the devs were cooking with Mythical Island. You know, in my opinion, Mythical Island is noticeably better than Triumphant Light, even though they're both mini sets, right? And obviously, Space Time Smackdown had the biggest impact, probably out of every, you know, new set in the game. Genetic Apex is its own thing because that was like, you know, that was, you know, 3 sets at once, or 3 packs at once, and they basically like started this whole game. But in terms of the newest sets, I think Triumphant Light is noticeably weaker and has noticeably less good cards in it compared to the other cards that we've seen so far. So let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know what cards you think I left off on Triumphant Light. Again, if we were re-ranking Mythical Island Space Time, the list would look drastically different because the meta has changed, the game has changed, and a lot of cards have come out since, you know, stuff like Mythical Island when I first made that list. So anyways, thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate you for being a part of this community and this channel that I've tried to help foster and grow. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate you taking time out of your day for me to be background noise. Maybe it's entertainment, maybe you'll learn something. But until next time, peace.